My name is Fred Gaudius, Senior Account Director at Zeldis Research, and I'm excited today to present our research findings from our very hot off the presses thought leadership research on ESG, socially responsible investing and other related issues. Do values drive action? So ESG is an area in the investment space where a considerable amount of market research has been done over the last 5 to 10 years, just because it's an area of intense growth in the investment marketplace. And you can see that in a few different ways. There's been an increase in the amount of assets in the sustainable and responsible investing space in the United States over the last, especially over the last 10 years. An increase in the number of funds operating in the investment arena in the ESG space, and correspondingly a great deal of press that you can see related to ESG and other related topics in the socially responsible investment space. So what does it all mean? And what can we say from it from a conceptual perspective? These are key elements of the research that we'll be presenting today in this webinar. In order to address some objectives, the objectives that we were talking about, we conducted an online quantitative survey with 1,000 United States consumers or customers. 768 of them were current investors, and the other 232 were likely investors. By that we mean that they are likely to begin investing in the next 2 to 3 years. In terms of qualifications, they needed to be either millennials, Gen Xers, or boomers. Those are the age ranges listed here. Financial decision maker for their household. They needed to have a household income of 40K or above. We went with some pretty standard parameters there, just thinking that these investors needed to be, or these respondents, I should say, whether current or likely investors, needed to have sufficient household income to actually invest, and needed to have or plan to have an investment account. We partnered with MarketCube for fielding and panel, so they provided not only sample, but also programming and hosting for this project. The survey was 15 minutes in length. It was conducted between May 15th and May 26th of this year, so relatively recent. And of course, a copy of the questionnaire is available upon request. Just feel free to reach out to one of us here at Zeldis, and we'd be happy to provide that for you. The majority of the results we'll be presenting in today's webinar will be from the quantitative research with investors, but there are a few slides and nuggets throughout the presentation from a different phase of the research as well. This was conducted more recently. Specifically, we conducted 2 webcam focus groups with financial advisors. One group was with financial advisors who are deep into the ESG space, and the second was with advisors who are more skeptical about the idea of socially responsible or ESG investing. This was with a national sample of advisors, and we partnered in this aspect with a couple of organizations, specifically Schlesinger Associates and Civicom, for recruiting and the platform. So again, the majority of the results we'll be presenting here will be quantitative in nature, with some qualitative around for context. Our second webinar, which will be conducted likely in September or October, will be a deeper dive into the webcam focus groups with financial advisors to lend a little bit more detail into the qualitative results that we had conducted from this audience. So do values drive action? In short, it sort of depends upon the value. And in fact, consumers do regularly engage in a number of actions that support their values. For instance, 58% choose to purchase goods that were made in America versus in another country. 56% take action specifically to help the environment. And 54% choose to purchase goods and services from a company because of its positive actions or values. Even 42% have reported boycotting a company because of its negative actions or values, while 38% have posted on social media about an issue that concerns them. On the flip side, considering where investing dollars go is a bit lower on the list. So only 27% of the investors in our research have evaluated a corporation's actions or values before making a decision to invest in the company financially. And an even smaller percentage, specifically 22%, evaluate companies included in their 401ks, mutual funds, or ETFs to make sure that their values align with yours. We followed this up with a 100-point allocation exercise, asking survey respondents to tell us how many points they would allocate to 5 different considerations of the investment decision. We find that 31% or 31 of the points on average are allocated to the expected return on investment. This is probably unsurprising, and ROI is a very important element of investing, as we all know. 21% of the points were allocated to the potential risk of the investment. 18% on the cost and fees for the investment. 19% from a recommendation from a financial professional or other sources. And if you're quick at math, you'll know that only the remaining 11% or 11 points were allocated to ensuring the companies you invest with align to your personal values. This 11% is actually only slightly higher for those who currently invest in ESG. It's 14% for that group. So you can see that really across the board, ensuring that investments align with personal values takes a back seat to other more important areas of the investment decision. We'll now move on to the next section of the report, which aligns to perceptions of ESG investing. One of the big barriers, as I think many of you on the line are aware, to ESG investment incidents is just the terminology being a bit of a challenge. There are various terms thrown around the investment space, all talking about more or less the same thing: ESG, SRI, values-based investing, just to name three. So what we wanted to get a sense of at a very conceptual high level in this research is how do people understand terminology? And what you'll see here is that only 4% of the respondents in our survey refer to what we'll be talking about in the next slide, which is essentially what we call socially conscious or socially responsible investing as ESG. 29% think that socially conscious investing is a more amenable term, or a more familiar term, I should say. 12% use both, and those aware of both terms tend to be more active investors. These are investors with higher investable assets who work with financial advisors more deeply. 55% of our respondents in our study have not heard of either term. They're not familiar with either term, whether it's ESG or socially conscious investing. Which leads us to how we then define those terms. So respondents were given the following definition at first of ESG investing. So ESG investing, also sometimes referred to as socially conscious investing, involves considering environmental, social, and governance issues in addition to the usual financials when evaluating potential companies to invest in. So this was the top line or high-level definition of ESG investing. More detail on the elements of ESG was given in subsequent questions. We expected, in line with previous research, that the vast majority of our survey respondents would not be very familiar with ESG. So we wanted to make sure that they had a clear amount of information about what ESG was before answering questions about what their perceptions were of this idea. So here's the description. This comes actually straight from Investopedia. You can just Google it. You can find it yourself. But it provides a little bit more detail as to the environmental, social, and governance criteria that make up the term ESG. Unsurprisingly, we find that awareness itself is a significant barrier into the ESG space. Only 4% of those in our study call themselves very familiar with it, and only 1 in 3, I would say, have some familiarity at least. That's rolling up the a little familiar, somewhat familiar, and very familiar. Half have never heard of it at all. And among current investors, 8% self-report having something related to ESG or socially conscious investments in their portfolio. This percent is actually on the higher side. It's in line with previous research into consumers in the ESG space. It's on the higher side, but I would expect that actually because ESG investments have been around for a while, and you would expect increasing growth in this space and increasing incidence of usage of ESG investments among investors. So what does the current ESG investor look like at this present point in time? Well, ESG investors tend to be younger. 48% of them are millennials. There are a higher proportion of Hispanic investors. 20% report being of Hispanic or Latino origin. They're more likely to be male. 63% of ESG investors are male. And again, this is all comparing current ESG investors to those who are investing but not in ESG. They're more likely to live in an urban setting. 38% live in an urban setting. They're more financially secure. 38% have 100K plus in investable assets. They're more likely to consider themselves as liberal. They're more likely to work with a financial advisor. This is a striking difference. Almost 70% of those who are current ESG investors work with a financial advisor. And 2 in 3 are college graduates, compared to 54% of investors who don't invest with ESG. There's no difference in political affiliation, so we do ask folks if they're Democrats, Independents, or Republicans. No difference there, which I thought was interesting. No difference in the absence or presence of children. You might plausibly think there'd be a difference there. There was none. I should remind everyone that based on that 8% number on the previous slide, current ESG investors, this is on a slightly lower base, specifically an N of 64 in that ESG investor bucket. So for those who are ESG investors, what motivates them to invest in ESG funds? We followed up this section of our survey with an open-ended question, and here are just a handful of verbatim responses that describe the nuance and motivations that ESG investors have in investing in this fund classification. You can see that there's a sense of personal importance, a sense of aligning with personal values, because they care about climate change, because they want to promote environmentally friendly business practices. The returns seem to beat the overall market and money goes to good causes. On the right-hand side as well, believe that companies that screen well for environmental, social, and governance issues will over time earn a higher return of their capital. So it's not just a soft values-based calculation. It's kind of a combination of values and financials that lead investors to making the decision to invest in this space. Among the total survey responses, some 1,000 survey respondents, most at least see some appeal in ESG investing. 27% find ESG investing extremely appealing. 58% find it somewhat appealing. So really 85% rolling up those two numbers find at least some appeal in ESG investing. We wanted to go a bit deeper though, and we wanted to understand, this term ESG obviously has some barriers, has some lower awareness. Do people understand what ESG means? And how do people find various elements of ESG appealing? In other words, the E, the S, and the G. So among those who find ESG, the idea of ESG appealing, 44% find the environmental percentage very appealing. 47% find the social aspect very appealing. 35%, slightly lower, find the corporate governance perspective appealing. Now, this pattern, the same overall pattern, also holds for those, by the way, who do not find the idea of ESG investing appealing. So if we were to look at the other subset of our respondent base, we would find the exact same pattern, albeit with lower numbers, where environmental and social investing outpaces the corporate governance element of ESG. In line with the appeal ratings that we saw 2 slides ago, most are at least open to the idea of ESG. 21% in fact are extremely likely, 6 or 7, to think about to invest in an ESG product over the next 3 to 5 years, supported by another 62% who are somewhat likely. That's a 3, 4, or 5 rating. We conducted a similar demographic profile on likely ESG investors. So now a couple slides ago we showed you the demographic profile of current ESG investors. Let's see what likely ESG investors look like. This is on a larger base, by the way, about 250 responses. Like current ESG investors, this group is more likely to be millennial. 50% of them are millennials. They skew non-white, not as specifically Hispanic or Latino as in the current ESG investor space, but this group tends to skew more into a non-white classification. They skew female, 56% as a matter of fact. They're more likely to be in an urban setting, just like current ESG investors. They are less financially secure, with a mean investable asset amount of $113,000, compared to $172,000 for those who are less likely to invest in ESG in the future. This group does skew self-identified politically liberal. They're more likely to work with a financial advisor. And like the ESG investors who exist, they're more likely to be college graduates. So on this slide, here's just a bit of qualitative context using open-ended verbatim responses to explain some of the reason why survey respondents were likely or unlikely to invest in ESG. For this, they often feel overwhelmed by the world's problems, so this offers a solve of sorts for their conscience. They believe it's a morally conscious way to invest in a world that is problematic, and they believe that companies that score better on ESG metrics should over time be more sustainable and earn a higher return on capital. You can see on the right-hand side some similar ideas or metrics about, some similar comments about reasons to be unlikely to invest in ESG. They think it's too risky. They don't invest to feel good about themselves as a person. And they always feel that socially conscious investments deliver lower returns. In line with the open-ended responses on the previous slide, we find that likely ESG investors tend to hold more liberal views than non-ESG investors. You can see on the left-hand side several liberal views. You can see on the right-hand side several conservative views, and these go hand in hand, right? So on the left-hand side, you might see the country should do whatever it takes to protect the environment. While on the right-hand side, you'll see the country has gone too far to protect the environment. And these are the ratings. In green, you can see ESG investors. In yellow, you can see likely ESG investors. And these groups really don't vary very much. But on almost all of the attributes you can see on this slide, the not likely to invest in ESG group tends to take the more conservative view on really all of the attributes here on this screen, with the exception of the third from the top, which reads, which is about power in the hands of large companies. These groups don't align very differently in terms of that attribute. So what are the benefits of ESG investing? Well, they include a few things. First, a positive impact on their self, making investors feel good about where they're investing their money, allowing them to invest in companies that share beliefs and values, and helping them align their investing to their beliefs. Additionally, there are positive impacts on society, allowing investors to avoid investing in companies that might hurt society, lessening the chance that companies they invest in will be involved in this environmental or social risk event, and helping them have a positive impact on the world itself. Here we were positively surprised to see that 35% were top two box likely to agree that offering that ESG would offer better returns than traditional investments is a key benefit of ESG. Further, 3 in 10, 30%, believe that a key benefit of ESG investing is that it might be a wave of the future. To be fair, we asked about benefits. We should also ask about barriers to investing in ESG. And here, another key barrier is a lack of knowledge. Almost half claim they do not know enough about ESG investing. 38% did not know ESG investing existed, and 26% find it hard to find information about ESG investing. Additional barriers include the lack of consistent standards or regulations for qualifying as an ESG investment, the expectation that ESG would have lower returns there at 30%, and 28% don't have time to research which companies would fit with ESG investing. What if these barriers were eliminated? Well, the top barrier, if it were eliminated, that might make people much more likely to invest in an ESG or socially conscious investment is, in fact, returns. So if ESG investments achieved returns that were as good or better than traditional investments, you would find 6 in 10 much more likely to invest in ESG. On the same vein, if their financial advisor were to present with ESG options, almost half would be more likely to invest in ESG. If there were a clear set of standards and regulations, 44% would be more likely to invest in this class of investments. And if there were investments across different sectors and countries, allowing them to maintain a more diverse portfolio, almost 2 in 5 would be more likely to invest in ESG. So we've been talking about this from a very clear consumer or investor-related standpoint. Now let's spend some time talking about the influence of a financial advisor. We'll be following up much more on this, by the way, with our second webinar to be debuted later this year, which will focus more on the qualitative follow-up research that we conducted with financial advisors. So here we're showing on the left-hand side the percent ranked in the top 3 for their top general investing resources, and on the right-hand side, among those who invest in ESG, or among those who consider investing in ESG, what resources they use to consider ESG. Here you can see the financial professional is a top general investing resource, with almost 7 in 10 listing the financial professional as a top investing resource in their top 3. Only 19%, however, use the financial professional for ESG. And here you can see results for online search, financial company websites, parent or other family member, a friend or colleague, books, media, and ads from financial services companies. The financial professional distinction here is probably worth spending a couple minutes on here. So financial professionals are not, if you notice on the right-hand side, a top ESG resource. In fact, those aware of ESG get information more likely from online searches and from media, such as TV, blogs, and publications. What this suggests to us here at Zeldis is that when it comes to ESG, investors are really going it alone in terms of finding out more about this type of investment. They're not reaching out to their financial advisor for reasons that we think might make sense in the next couple of slides. So among those who have a financial advisor, 40% have asked their financial advisor about values-based investing. However, among those with a financial advisor, only 12% own a values-based or ESG type investment. So why the disconnect? Well, here we'll pull in some findings from our qualitative. This is consistent with what at least one financial advisor says about how they handle these requests. I guess they, meaning their clients, read an article about socially responsible investments, and so they wanted to look at a couple of options. I went through the options with them, and I showed them returns, and that ended it right there when they looked at the returns. So that here in this case, returns just weren't up to par. And whether that's perception or reality, the actual reality of what happens is almost 3 in 4 of those investors who ask their financial advisor about values-based investing end up not investing in line with their values. Whether that's a marketplace issue or whether it's an actual return issue, in other words, is this a marketing issue or an actual returns issue, remains to be seen. So why don't financial professionals recommend ESG investing? Well, from our qualitative focus groups, and again, this is a little bit of a sneak peek, we'll have more to say on this in our next webinar. There are 4 key reasons. The first is the perception or reality that ESG investments offer lower returns. The quote here, there's nothing altruistic about telling your clients to take a lower return on something just because it's in the best interest. I'm not going to recommend something that's not as fruitful. The idea of fiduciary responsibility, although a little bit more nebulous in the individual retail space, still exists in the minds of many advisors. We're in a goal-oriented profession is at the very end of that quote, and this is by far the top reason why financial advisors do not recommend ESG investing as much as perhaps they could or should. The lack of track record is a key barrier. They don't meet the screeners or the screening criteria that advisors use to recommend investments, and if that's the case, it's clearly a non-starter. The definitions are perceived as subjective. What I think fits ESG, someone else might not, and so defining it really is the first thing. So when it comes to defining this whole category of investments, advisors tend to agree that the definitions are fuzzy and a bit subjective. And finally, complexity plays a role. The investment process can be a complex one to begin with. The most difficult part for me is the additional complexity that ESG adds to the overall process. It's a whole layer of investing on top of the existing investments that these clients have with their advisors, so it ends up not just adding one fund, but actually adding a layer of complexity in some instances. Let's change gears for a minute. This is not an existing idea. We'll be totally upfront about this. This idea of patriotic investing is a completely new idea, a completely new type of values-based investing, and we wanted to explore reactions to it to prove a point. We provided respondents later in our survey, and this is investors, not advisors, but investors, with the following definition of patriotic investing. It can be used to describe investing in companies that have patriotic values, such as having made in America production, offering military and veteran hiring programs, and strictly adhering to laws preventing employment of undocumented immigrants. So the idea of patriotic investing actually has pretty broad appeal, with 89% finding it at least somewhat appealing, and 43% finding it extremely appealing. That's top 2 box on a 7-point scale. Compare and contrast this to the ratings that we found several slides ago for the idea of ESG investing. And again, we walked people through the idea of ESG investing, not so much using the terminology ESG, but giving people a great deal of background and context to give them the idea of what ESG is. And you can see a 16 percentage point spread there in the top 2 box ratings. That's 27% for ESG and 43% for this novel idea of patriotic investing. To parallel the ESG section of the survey, we also asked for the specific appeal of patriotic investing elements. Unsurprisingly, we find this pattern. The Made in America element is highly regarded at 63% top 2 box. The military and veteran hiring program idea is highly regarded as well, the same percentage. This is a bit more polarizing, and I think, given our current political climate, that makes sense. Only 46% of investors or who find the idea extremely appealing, find this idea of adhering to laws preventing employment of undocumented immigrants idea appealing. So where the rubber meets the road is likelihood to invest, and what we find here is that 45% of those in our survey are would be extremely likely to invest in a patriotic product if it existed in the marketplace. This is a 24 percentage point bump versus the ESG top two box, which was at 21%, if you recall from earlier in the study. So what are the demographics of these patriotic investors? In other words, how are they different from the ESG investors that we profiled earlier in this research? Well, they're more likely to be baby boomers. 33% are more likely to be boomers. They're more likely to be conservative, and this is not on this slide, but they're also more likely to be Republican. So these two things are very much aligned. Political conservatism and alignment with the Republican Party are both more likely among likely patriotic investors. They skew slightly female. They're more likely to be rural. This is the opposite of the pattern of what we saw with ESG. They work with a financial advisor 45% of the time. They're more likely to have kids, and they're more religious. 83% have a religious affiliation. And they're less educated. So 16% have a high school degree or less, versus those unlikely to invest in patriotic investing. Only 7% have a high school degree or less. Here are some reasons why respondents in our research are likely to invest in patriotic investing. And here we can see some patriotic ideals, so believing in America first, who like to contribute to their economy in the U.S., and especially because they'd like to contribute to veteran hiring. Good U.S. business is good for the economy, which is good for returns, and already backing a patriotic cause. So investing in a patriotic company would be a natural step for them to take. So in this particular person's response, the patriotic values tend to align with their action that they actually have taken in the past. On the right-hand side, you can see some reasons why respondents who are unlikely to invest in patriotic ideas are unlikely have these ideas. They don't invest with emotions, and actually the fourth comment from the top is interesting because it's not necessarily politically motivated. It's more rational than that. It's that for the same reasons that they would not invest in ESG funds. It's not a good way to ensure they would receive a good return. There's no standard as to what a patriotic investment is. And there may be benefits to investing in foreign companies that you would be missing out on. Here's a similar slide layout to what we saw earlier in the presentation. Again, on the left-hand side, we have the liberal view. On the right-hand side, we have the conservative view, and going down the list, we have some social, environmental, and corporate governance-related attributes. The country, on the top, we have environment, we have gay marriage, too much power being concentrated in the hands of large companies, immigrants strengthen our country because of hard work and talents, discrimination is a key reason many minorities can't get ahead. It is more important to control gun ownership, and results of the Me Too movement are mostly positive. On the right-hand side, you have the opposite, more conservative tact of that point of view. So in green, we have those who are likely to invest in patriotic investments, and in red, we have those not likely to invest in patriotic investments. And you can see that on all 7 of these attributes, those likely to invest in patriotic investments are more to the right than those who are not likely to invest in patriotic investments. Like the ESG topic, the most alignment is on governance issues. That's third from the top there. You can see the bullets are closest to each other on that. It's actually also pretty close there on the top one as well, related to the environment. So you can see that those two issues tend to be less polarizing with respect to attitudes toward patriotic investing. So what do we take away from all this? We wanted to conclude the webinar today with just some ideas and key takeaways that we have that we've come up with here at Zeldis related to this research. And of course, we consider all of our thought leadership to be an ongoing conversation between ourselves and those who are interested in what we're doing. So I would welcome you to take an opportunity to ask in the questions bar of the webinar any questions that you have. I'm happy to answer them at the webinar, or you can reach out to me as well, and I'm happy to address them offline too. Anyway, here are our key takeaways. The first one is that substantial conceptual barriers remain toward the idea of ESG or socially responsible investing at the present time. These barriers include, but are not limited to, low awareness, perceived subjectivity of investment definitions, and also the perception of lower performance. What ends up happening is, though there are potential benefits, I mean, we saw that there are perceptions that investing in these in ESG or socially responsible investing has positive impacts on not only themselves but also society. However, they're outweighed by knowledge barriers and perceived lower returns in the ESG space. Correspondingly, advisors rarely advocate for ESG investments, and what ends up happening is the large swath of customers who are interested in these investments often do research on their own. When investors do speak to their advisors about ESG, we see about 3/4 of the time they don't end up investing in something related to this. This could be for numerous reasons, and this research isn't designed really to speculate on those reasons, but a few of them could be the fact that returns are indeed lower and there's less of a track record for these investments. It could also just include perceptions and marketing issues related to ESG investments. The jury's still out on this, and we'll have more to say about this in our second phase of the webinar as well. Next, the idea of patriotic investing, a concept that doesn't yet exist. There was more appeal for this than there was for our definition of ESG investing. And our hypothesis is that patriotic investing is rooted in a few specific elements versus the broader, less clearly understood area of ESG investing. What's the takeaway here for investment companies? Well, to the extent possible, being able to root ESG investments in very clear ideas, these funds in very clear value systems, very clear exclusions or inclusions, regardless of the approach taken, being able to do this to the extent possible in the future will help remove the present ambiguity around ESG investing. And just one closing note here, increasing the uptake of ESG investing is going to depend on establishing a track record for competitive funds and perhaps for potentially focusing on a more narrow focus for these funds. That is E, S, or G versus just the idea of E, S, and G, or one or two clearly defined ESG issues and concerns. Doing that might potentially map interest or appeal of these investments and these fund options into the territory that we currently see with patriotic investing. So I'd like to take the time now to thank everyone for their participation in the webinar. I really do appreciate it. My contact information is there on the right. You can also feel free to reach out to my colleague Amy Ray, who's on the left. We're both happy to address any questions that you have offline related to this topic.